welcome. We are at the June 26th, so we're reaching the end of the month here. Freedom Hub Working Group edition, and we're pretty excited today that we've got Bob Poole from, or Robert Poole, I should say, from Reason Foundation and Reason Organization, Reason Magazine. And we're going to have some really enlightening information about transportation, everyone's favorite topic at certain times of the morning and certain times of the afternoon. So that'll be great. And while we're waiting for some other people to come, just as a quickie reminder, I'm going to do a little filler here, that we have a couple things that you can connect with us on. So you've got the bit.ly here that you can go ahead and share with others to have them come and receive this. And just so you know, every Monday we send a notice out that tells you who's coming up this coming Wednesday and who was on last Wednesday, and it gives you the link to the last Wednesday's recording. So in other words, this event today will be posted this coming Monday, and then we'll also do some greatest hits, and we also direct everybody over to our Brighton channel, and that is right over here. And you'll see this has got all of that we've been doing. This has got all of them in here for the most part. And this way you can kind of review some ones you've missed. And there really are some fantastic ones in here, I have to tell you. And please circulate these amongst friends. We're trying to continue to build our viewership on this channel, so that'll be great. And then also we have a nice little sponsor too, which is yourfreedomhub.com, and this is a way where we're kind of breaking the industry apart a little bit. And I'm going to let Charles tell you about this for a quick moment, because he's also going to tell us who's coming up in the next coming weeks.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jeff, and welcome, Bob. It is important to acknowledge the sponsors who allow us to have this libertarian fun every week. And before I preview, just real quick about yourfreedomhub.com. Basically, they've taken the best of what healthcare has to offer to try to rescue your smaller entrepreneur families and small businesses from the Affordable Care Act prices. So they'll give you that health payment protection for a lot less money, and it also makes you into a cash payer, so you have more choices to shop around and get control. So thank you, yourfreedomhub.com. Jeff, as far as speakers coming up, next week we have Adam Kokesh, who was an early protester of the Iraq War, who now is running for president on a localization campaign. Whether you're left or right, just devolve everything to localities, and we can have more control over the type of government we want in our communities. And then we return to the DC think tanks in a couple of weeks with the Competitive Enterprise Institute's John Berlau, who's going to update us on all things deregulatory in the financial area, including Bitcoin. 3 weeks, we have another professor of the libertarian persuasion, Art Carden, on how society would look without any government limits. And finally, as we always do, the fourth, looking at a month, we have Ivan Eland, my former Cato colleague, now at Independence, on the cost of intervening overseas. So that is our preview, Jeff.
Fantastic. Why don't you give us a couple second interview about Robert here for a minute here.
Well, Robert Poole is Mr. Privatization at the foundation, Reason Foundation. Everyone in the movement knows that he does the nitty-gritty studies with local governments and states on how to speed up the highways and air traffic control and other transportation methods with public-private partnerships, innovative financing, to fix up these roads and infrastructure. So it's really great to have someone like him get a libertarian within the bowels of local government infrastructure. So a lot of people on the ground in the states learn about liberty through Bob Poole's work. And a lot of us libertarians know him from before that as the guy at Reason Magazine going back decades. So when he talks about privatization, Jeff, I'm sure you and I and others would love to hear a quick history on his magazine and how far back he goes in the movement. So Jeff, there's your intro.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much for having me today. We have major problems with the transportation that most of us use, getting around by highway in our cars or getting around by air travel. And in both cases, we have an infrastructure that is highly politicized, hardly uses pricing at all, and is failing to deliver what we really ought to have in terms of top class transportation. So let's get started. everybody who drives knows we have chronic congestion, potholes, deficient bridges, a lot of pork barrel projects, and huge battles about gas taxes. And let's look at congestion. This is what a lot of us face. I lived in LA for 20 years and faced that every single day going to and from work. The estimated annual cost to people just in terms of wasted time and wasted fuel is $160 billion per year. And that really cuts into the productivity of our urban areas. Potholes are ubiquitous across the country, especially in our cities. Average American spends an additional $200 a year on wear and tear on the car due to potholes, bad pavement. But it's really bad in California, in Los Angeles and San Francisco. It's in the $800 per person per year, per car owner per year. And that's just, it should be intolerable, but that we let this go on. Collapsed bridges, we have tens of thousands of structurally deficient bridges in the United States, and a few get fixed every year, but more age out and add to that, so we're hardly making any progress at all on that. And this is a projection of what's going to happen partly because of federal fuel economy standards, and partly with the likely big penetration of electric vehicles into our fleet over the next several decades. The revenue coming from our fuel taxes is likely to decline by as much as $50 billion by 2045 per year. So we've got a funding problem as well as a bad management problem. Now, in my book, Rethinking America's Highways, which came out last year, I lay out a vision of uncongested freeways, dedicated truck lanes on routes that are full of trucks, no toll booths anywhere, excellent maintenance, condition of the roads, the ability to expand when and where needed without having huge political fights, and a true users pay, users benefit funding system, just like you have with your electric, for your electric bill, your cell phone bill, et cetera. And the question is, how could we get there here? And what I concluded in many years of research on this is that we have the wrong model for organizing and managing and paying for highways. Highways are infrastructure, just like all the other things that we depend on, electricity and phones and natural gas and cable and water. But all the others are businesses, whether they're run by government like a city water department or an investor-owned electric utility. You pay the business directly based on precisely how much you use, and you get a monthly bill that shows you that. Only highways are different from that. You don't have any idea what they really cost. You don't know who's responsible for which roads. Milton Friedman got it right when he wrote like 40 years ago that highways are a socialized industry. That except for a few toll roads, they don't use pricing. They don't do long-term financing. They try to do things on pay-as-you-go basis out of annual cash flow, which doesn't make sense for large-scale capital-intensive business. They don't even call you a customer. They call you a user. When I just started working in transportation seriously, working with state DOTs, I was appalled that they call people users and not customers. Only toll roads call people customers, which says something, it seems to me. And the politicization is horrendous. Politicians and state legislatures love to cut ribbons on new stuff. They don't get any political bennies out of proper maintenance. So maintenance tends to get the leftovers of the annual budgets. Now, highways as businesses, well, we already have toll agencies, which are a kind of government company. It's better than the state DOTs and the legislature, but they could be better. But they could also be investor-owned companies. They would charge you for every mile you drive. They would have the revenue to issue bonds and finance big improvements. And they would decide projects based on whether they make sense, whether there's a return on investment, not based on how politically beneficial they are. Now, the large part of the book is trying to explain why this is not a pipe dream. That before the auto era, we had hundreds, actually probably several thousand private turnpikes in the United States. They were put out of business eventually when canals and railroads came along, which were better at the time. But today, if you go to Europe and drive the toll motorways in France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, those are private investor-owned companies operating on long-term franchises, very much like electric utilities in the United States. That model has, in the last 20 years, gone to Australia, and almost all the expressways in the major cities are investor-owned companies like that. And likewise, in all the growing countries in South America and Mexico, an increasing fraction of the major roads are investor-owned companies on this model. So we could do that in the United States. It's not a pipe dream. We actually have been doing it to some extent. In Northern Virginia, there's projects right outside of Washington, D.C. that added express toll lanes to congested freeways. Same thing in Dallas and Fort Worth in Texas. And there's a new one under construction in Houston. The Indiana Toll Road and the Chicago Skyway have both been privatized as long-term investor-owned companies for 75 years. Puerto Rico has one. We have several projects in Florida, where I am currently based also. So it's not that we can't do this. It's just that we haven't done very much of it so far. These are long-term public-private partnerships. We call them P3s. And it's very much like electric utility franchises. They financed by debt and equity. It's like when you buy a house, the equity is the cash you put in up front, and the debt is the mortgage. Well, these companies finance things the same way. They put in good, solid cash, typically about 20 or 25% of the total cost of a major highway project or a replacement bridge, and they issue revenue bonds based on the toll revenue for the debt. And these projects, they're done as businesses. And so instead of building them cheap the first time, the way state governments do, they build them to last so that they minimize the life cycle cost, not just the first cost. And that means that they end up spending less overall because they build them right in the first place. And there's guaranteed long-term maintenance, so you're not going to have the pothole problems that our irresponsible government system provides. We also had, this is some fun couple examples of adding capacity where people would say, oh no, there's no room to widen the freeway. This one is in Tampa, Florida. It's done by the Tampa Toll Agency. They needed to add capacity to this expressway. They didn't want a big fat fight over buying up condemning land on either side. So they built on 6 feet wide pillars this beautiful reversible express toll lanes that have been in operation for 5 or 6 years now and very successful. This one is in Dallas, Texas, the LBJ freeway. The government had said we'll never widen it again, but then they decided they really wanted to add express toll lanes. So they asked the private sector, how can we do this? Private sector came up with the cross section that you show there. They rebuilt the entire freeway, $2.6 billion, all paid for out of tolls, and cantilevered the regular lanes over the express lanes. So the overall LBJ freeway is no wider than it was before, but that was the constraint they had to do. So as I said, where does money come from? The equity comes. There's a new phenomenon that most people don't realize exists called global infrastructure investment funds. About 40% of them are based on Wall Street, and others are based in London and other places around the world. Interestingly, pension funds are starting to invest equity in infrastructure as well, all kinds, not just highways and bridges, but electricity and water systems and seaports and airports. And of course, the debt markets, the bond markets primarily do the debt for these projects. And so far, between debt and equity, in the last 15 years, we've had $36 billion of private capital invested in these kinds of US highway projects. Now, that sounds like a big number, but it's an absolute drop in the bucket compared to at least $1 trillion that really would be worthwhile to spend over the next several decades on improving the US highway system. The interstate highways are starting to wear out. That is the biggest thing that needs attention. They were designed at best with a 50-year lifetime, and most of them were finished a long time ago and need to be basically rebuilt from the ground up. Many of them don't have enough lanes. They have obsolete major interchanges that create huge congestion bottlenecks, and there are no dedicated truck lanes anywhere. So this project I describe in the book is about a $1 trillion project to do all these things. But the studies that we did at Reason Foundation show that it would be toll feasible in all but 4 or 5 states to finance these entire projects as using toll revenue at reasonable, realistic, modest toll rates, but adjusted annually for inflation. And a much better second generation interstate system done largely with private capital is ours for the asking if we can convince the politicians to do it. And this is the cover of my book. That is the cover bridge is in France, in southern France. It's a long-term public-private partnership done by a investor-owned company that's the descendant of the company that built the Eiffel Tower. And this bridge across a valley on one of the French motorways saves about 45 minutes compared to going on the winding roads down into the valley and back up to the motorway. Now let's talk about air traffic control. This has very similar problems to our highway system. It's underfunded, it's low tech. In this case, the same agency runs air traffic control and regulates air safety, so it's a conflict of interest. Self-regulation is a terrible idea. And most other countries in the last 30 years have privatized their system. The United States has not. Air traffic control is a system that keeps planes from running into each other or running into the ground. And they use systems, procedures, and facilities to do that. And they are always regulated by safety. But in most of the world, they're regulated at arm's length by somebody that's different from the air traffic provider, but not here. In this country, one agency, big bureaucracy called the Federal Aviation Administration, does safety regulation. It makes grants to airports. It provides air traffic control, and it has a grab bag of other functions, including managing commercial space launches and drones and so forth. It's paid for by taxes, all paid for by taxes. When you fly, you pay a ticket tax and a segment fee. That brings in those and a few other passenger taxes, pay for 80 to 90% of the total budget. The general fund, i.e. general revenues like income taxes, pays for another 10 to 20%. And about 2/3 of that goes for air traffic control. The other biggest part goes for airport grants, and the rest is management and administration of the different functions. And it's paid for elsewhere in all other developed nations. It's not paid for by taxes. The aircraft operators pay charges directly to the provider, like utility bills or like toll roads. The ICAO, which is the international agency that provides for the treaties and so forth, has principles on how to charge, and that's not necessarily the best way, but it works. And in most countries, the air traffic control system is self-supporting, because the government allows them to charge what they need to pay for both the capital costs and the operating costs of their system. They are businesses, they're mostly government companies like our toll agencies in the United States, but they work better than our bureaucratic system. The corporatization trend started 30 years ago with New Zealand, a small country that broke the mold completely. They took the air traffic system out of their transport agency, gave it the ability to collect the fees and charges, and it has been self-funded ever since. This led to a wave of copycats in countries like Germany and Britain, and all the Scandinavian countries, Australia, South Africa. There are 60 countries today that have self-supporting air traffic corporations that issue revenue bonds for modernization and are directly accountable to their aviation customers, rather than to parliaments or legislatures, or in our case, Congress. So they've been depoliticized in all these other countries. The FAA lags far behind the other providers. It's late in using GPS navigation, which we all use in our cars, and which trucking companies use. It's way behind on digital communications. Almost all the interactions between pilots and air traffic controllers is on shared voice channels that often interfere with each other. They're not using GPS-based landing systems, which are cheaper and more effective than the old-fashioned instrument landing systems that have been in use since World War II in the United States. A number of other countries are using GPS landing systems now. The new innovation in Europe and Australia and New Zealand is remote control towers. At airports, you no longer need to build a 30-story high structure with elevators and all this sort of stuff. because you can put up a series of cameras, including infrared cameras that see through fog, on poles around the airport to monitor every part of the runways and taxiways, and have a control room on the ground. In fact, the control room doesn't even have to be at the airport. It can be in some secure location somewhere else. In fact, what they're doing now in Europe, in Germany and Norway and Sweden, is building consolidated remote tower centers, where one center controls air traffic at 3, 5, or in some cases a dozen airports. And the FAA is way behind, has not spent any money on this at all in the United States. Now, the benefits of a reform system, if we could actually do it in this country, would remove politicization, just like in highways, would escape the constraints of the federal budget. Whenever there's a budget shutdown or spending freeze, controllers go on furlough. They don't get paid until the end of the thing. It puts air safety and air traffic at risk. The FAA cannot issue revenue bonds, so it has, just like state highway people, have to do everything out of annual cash flow, which means modernization takes decades instead of doing large projects in a few years. The system would, if it were reformed and use GPS and other things, would have fewer delays, which means faster trips when we travel. It would be lower cost once they've invested in the new technology, and it would be safer because of arm's length safety regulation. The almost good news was that in 2017, I was part of a big coalition that I helped put together with airlines, the controllers unions, and the Business Roundtable and other groups to actually do a federally chartered nonprofit air traffic corporation that would be outside the federal government, arm's length from the safety regulator, would be paid just like in other countries with direct user payments. But for political reasons, they did not include the private planes having to pay for it. It would be outside the federal budget and therefore not affected by all the budget shenanigans. And it would have a governing board representing all the key aviation stakeholders, very similar to what Canada has done. Fortunately, that failed. Trump first supported it and had a little conference at the White House, and then did nothing when his support was needed, because some Republicans that got contributions from the private plane organizations were reluctant to vote for it and ultimately did not vote for it. Private pilots and organized AstroTurf groups to scare small airports that this was actually a plot to turn the air traffic system over to the big airlines and that small airports would be cut off. And the government unions, except for the controllers, all thought this was terrible because it would open the door to more government employees being let go from the security of being in the civil service system. So they passed a bill to reauthorize the FAA for 5 more years, which means there's no real opportunity for another reform bill. But so one sign of hope is that Senator Ted Cruz has this year come out. Now he says we really should have done that and wants to do it in the future. So that's the sad story, but there's hope there. There's a lot of reforms that have gone on. My book and Reason Foundation's work and other things have said we can depoliticize our highways and we can depoliticize our air traffic system, bring in private capital, modernize them, and we would have much better travel on the ground and safer and faster travel in the air. So with that, I'm happy to entertain questions and comments and disagreements, even if there are some. Thank you.
Bob, that was really very good. And I knew little bits and pieces of what you were talking about, but when you put it in such great encapsulation, it's pretty acute how bad our problem really is. And it's interesting, it's the 2 most vital things in terms of our operation. You know, it's a little bit timely because last session we had a discussion about the Jones Act and how that would appear to probably be impinging a little bit on some successes in this country too, in terms of opening up the waterways and other avenues of transportation.
Absolutely, and I strongly support getting rid of the Jones Act.
You know, it's amazing. And I didn't think about it. The speaker commented how, with Puerto Rico's disaster that they got a 20-day reprieve from it, but 20 days is like meaningless. Yet, it just went in one ear and out the other to everybody sitting there in the country when they heard it on the news. It's like,
right.
Whatever. What does that mean? They're just sending a couple of extra boxes of cereal.
Right.
So, It is interesting to see, and I know you've had bits and pieces where they've had some privatized roads and so on. Why is that not really kind of caught on? Because I appreciate trying to do this giant, seismic shift is always brutally tough to near impossible, but that continual chipping away and having local successes, the way the states have one by one legalizing marijuana is kind of shifting the federal or the national footprint. Why is none of the smaller stuff you guys have worked on through the years really caught fire in
well, I mean,
fashion?
Yeah, it's a complicated problem. The status quo is very powerful. A lot of legislators love the idea of they make the decisions and get to cut ribbons on the projects that they got in their district. It helps them get reelected. So that's one problem. A lot of the construction firms, particularly the medium-sized and small ones, are very afraid of these long-term public-private partnerships because they know giant companies are the ones that can put together the proposals and find the financing. But what they don't realize is that those companies, those big projects, all use hundreds of subcontractors. And so there's lots of business. It actually expands the pie by bringing in new funding to fix a lot of the problems and build express lanes and replace aging bridges and all those things. But it's a hard slog to persuade a critical mass of the construction industry that this is really to their benefit, and likewise construction workers unions. They're not generally opposed, but they haven't been pushing for it. Part of my hope is that the public pension funds in the United States, which are all grossly underfinanced, they don't have enough money to meet the retirement promises that they've made to the retiring baby boom generation workers. They are needing to diversify their portfolios. They're starting to invest in infrastructure. Even from California, CalPERS, which is the nation's largest public pension fund, now owns 10% of privatized Gatwick Airport in London, and they own 12.5% of the privatized Indiana Toll Road. So if more of the pension funds start not only investing in these things, but telling legislatures that they need more of these projects to be done by public-private partnerships where the pension funds, can invest equity and earn a return on that equity. This could really open the doors toward more of this.
Fantastic. Well, I want to open this up for some questions to others that are out there today. And so if you'll do me the favor of raising your hand with that little raise hand symbol, we'll be able to kind of grab you directly. While I'm waiting for someone to raise their hand, with the Jones Act, and I guess some of what you're describing, there's like little regional airports and other kind of little like by the wayside type infrastructure in the states that's just languishing. I would assume some of that stuff would flourish in ways we've never imagined before.
Well, that's right. A lot of those small airports don't have control towers, and they would really love to. They believe, and to some extent it's true, that with a control tower, they'll be more attractive to business. It would be safer to fly in and out of there. And this remote control tower idea, the way it's being applied in Europe, like in Germany and Sweden and Norway, would permit a single control center to provide control tower services to 3, 4, 5 small airports that would never qualify under the existing federal rules for a control tower. So it would be a big boost for the smaller airports, particularly the ones that either don't have a control tower or have one that's aging and needs to be replaced. And there's hardly any federal budget money to help them pay for replacing an aging, obsolete control tower.
As a simple example, I'm here myself in Cleveland, Ohio, and we have one called Burke Lakefront, and it's literally right on the lakefront, just in front of the city itself at Lake Erie. And it's a pretty interesting locale, but it's dwindled down to doing next to nothing. Used to have flights to Detroit and some of those little jumper hop ones, which took the pressure off and made it a lot more convenient for that business commuter than they have to go through the big commercial airport we've got with all the tourists and all the rest of what's going on over there. And it's sad to see it's become like a ghost town almost from what it was.
Yeah, that's the kind of airport that could be revitalized if it had a modern control tower.
David, I see you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Jeff. Ed, this is David Demarest with Roads to Freedom. My observation is that the political process is a dubious resource for depoliticizing anything. So to follow up on Jeff's question, I like your idea of approaching pension funds do you have additional non-political strategies for depoliticizing the transportation industry?
Well, my strategies are to try to build coalitions and to find and publicize the projects that are out there that are exemplars of what we could be doing more of. We only, about 30 state legislatures have enacted what they call P3 or privatization laws for transportation. Most of them are unworkable. They create way too much risk for any company that would try to bid because they still let the legislature try to micromanage the terms of the project. And so we only see projects going on so far in less than a dozen states. And so what we need to do is get more publicity for these big mega projects and smaller ones too that are not possible to do even in most of the states that think they have the right legislative framework. And pension funds, I think, could be helpful in doing that. There's also there's a place for some things that we might even get Congress to do. When private sector goes to finance projects, they typically would have to issue taxable revenue bonds because only governments traditionally can issue tax-exempt revenue bonds, which is a difference in interest rates, and it means the cost of financing is less if you have tax-exempt bonds. So Congress, about 15 years ago, passed a little program authorizing that private companies could work with states on public-private partnerships and get access to tax-exempt private activity bonds, revenue bonds that would be paid out of the project revenue. Well, that $15 billion is almost used up, and it only applies to new projects like a new toll road or a new airport. It doesn't apply to a big P3 project that would rebuild an aging interstate highway or replace a $2 billion failing bridge project. So expanding that program in Congress to enable tax-exempt private activity bonds for rebuilding crumbling infrastructure would be a huge shot in the arm for making this happen more widely.
That particular option is pretty much of a no-brainer, really. That's a great one. I didn't even know about that one.
That was, believe it or not, that was actually in the Trump infrastructure proposal from a year ago, February. But that kind of is not even being emphasized by the White House any longer. The guy, the infrastructure guru who was on the staff, who I've known for many, many years, left after a year because once the plan was done and there was no action to do anything with it, he decided, well, I can find better use of my time in the private sector.
Sure. Sadly, I got lost in the shuffle with everything else that wrapped up. Kishore, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, my question is about the contracting that happens between the private sector and the public sector.
Yes.
And it seems to be prone to failure. There have been a few recent projects, like I remember there was this toll being done, toll bridge, or was it a road that was being done by a Spanish company, and it didn't work out. So what is the reason for these failures in contracting?
Thank you. It's a good question. There have been some failures. We had a brand new toll road in San Diego County, which included a big bridge, filed Chapter 11 after the financial markets collapse and the Great Recession. The original long-term P3 for the Indiana toll road also filed Chapter 11, again, after the financial markets collapse and the Great Recession. What happened was that in the first decade of this century, there was so much money chasing so few projects that people financed projects based on very overly optimistic traffic projections. And they were not stress tested to be able to survive a serious recession. And we had a really serious recession after the financial markets collapse. And that's what happened to both of those projects. The good news on both of those projects is that there were no taxpayer bailouts. The risk of failure was indeed transferred, as it's supposed to be, to the investors in those companies. In the case of the San Diego toll road, no private sector bidder wanted it, so the San Diego Association of Governments bought it for half what it cost to build, and enabled lower toll rates, and it's now doing very well as a toll road, although I'm disappointed that it's not being run privately. The Indiana Toll Road is a much bigger success story. They put it up for auction for the remaining about 69 years of the long-term concession, and pension funds put together a consortium and bid $5.7 billion, financed almost half by hard money equity investment, and won the bidding. And so the bondholders got compensated; they got paid off fully, and the state, again, there was no taxpayer bailout. So these days, these projects are being financed much more conservatively, based on stress-tested traffic projections and more equity and less debt. So they're much less likely to fail. But even so, the agreements all specify that if they fail because of lack of traffic, it's the companies on the hook. The investors have to eat it, not the taxpayers. So that's a great protection for taxpayers.
That certainly is. Abigail?
Yes, I have two examples from Michigan for you.
Okay.
You mentioned public-private partnerships as one solution and gave as a sort of example utilities. First, I'll just mention our Detroit-Windsor Bridge going from US to Canada, from Michigan to Ontario, and that had a 70-some year, maybe 75-year ownership monopoly by a family, and was renowned for corruption in the area and for its battles with the state of Michigan, who never felt that they got their fair cut. I will say that as a privately owned entity, the tolls were fantastically low.
Right.
The other example, just to put out there, I am very dubious of public-private partnerships. I've just heard of way too many examples that they have consumers over a barrel because they use the law that gives them advantage depending, they pick and choose which laws that they want to follow, whether they're public or whether they're private. And an example is our utilities in Michigan. We have DTE and consumers who control 90% of the electricity market. Mm-hmm. And they, I believe it's mostly consumers, spent on our chief state house representative, free market representative for free market electricity, and for opening up the market, did a bill, had a stack of papers he'd show anybody, was making great strides and ran for the Senate. And they spent against him $1 million in dark money.
Wow.
They more than quadrupled our previous state record when the Senate was tied, Republican versus Democrat, and somebody died. And so they had to run an election. And that was like 40 years ago or something. So, it's this whole public-private thing, just be sure you've got a good lawyer on your side when you set up one of those, because they can be bad news.
Right. One of the things I advise states when they do have a P3 law and start doing projects, they have to have and pay for very top-notch financial advisors and legal advisors to craft these long-term agreements so that the public interest is protected as well as the investor interest. And that's why this kind of arrangement, at least for infrastructure, is probably not going to be workable for projects that are less than about $1 billion scale, because the cost of doing all that legal work and financial analysis is too high of a burden for small projects to be done that way.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
I was going to say,
and
Bob,
on the electricity thing, a similar battle is going on in Virginia right now. The major electric utility there is fighting deregulation proposals. That Reason Foundation is involved in a coalition supporting electricity deregulation in Virginia. And so we're seeing the brunt the brunt of the lobbying power of the existing incumbent electric utility.
I was going to say, for an average person, just like us as consumers, just floating out there in the world, what is it that we can do to kind of bring to bear on either of these issues?
Well, I think probably air traffic control is probably too specialized an area to have much effect on, and as only Congress holds the purse strings and the decision making. But as a motorist, as say if you're a member of AAA or whatever, you can make your voice heard when there are proposals to add express toll lanes to congested freeways. Take a look at them. In many cases, they make good sense. We have, by the way, I invented the concept of investor finance express toll lanes 30 years ago, and there are now 42 such projects around the country that are relieving congestion every single day, morning and afternoon rush hours. So these projects, only one in El Paso has ever been implemented and then taken down because there was hardly any people using it, and that never should have been done in the first place. But all the others have been quite popular and mostly effective. They're sometimes not as good as they could be because government sometimes puts on price controls. Just when you need a market price to equate supply and demand, governments come along and put, well, you can't charge more than X. And sometimes you need to charge more than X in order to prevent the lanes from clogging up. But so there's continuing challenges.
Well, it's a process like all of this stuff, and especially when the political angle's in there, and especially if it becomes contentious like it's been, then it makes it easier just to satisfy the status quo. So I'm sure they love
status quo is always the default option, yeah.
Yeah, when you have division, then we just don't do anything, which is really a vote for keeping things like they are. So those parties love when there's dissension, I'm sure. So that's interesting. So what's kind of up next? I mean, you've got this out there. How are you trying to build some momentum, or than just continue? Some well, you're the reporter on it in some respects up till now.
No, I continue to write research papers on this. I put out a big report, Reason Foundation report, in April on how and why we should do toll finance reconstruction and modernization of the interstate highways, and it's getting a fair amount of attention. We can get some of the provisions for this in the Congress's next federal surface transportation bill, which is supposed to be enacted by September 30th of next year, and the Senate committee is already starting to work on it, and so is the Office of the Secretary of Transportation, whom I know personally. So I'm hoping to get a number of these ideas, freeing up federal restraints, expanding the tax-exempt revenue bond program, and allowing it to be used for rebuilding crumbling infrastructure. Those might actually get into this next federal surface transportation bill. And we also, my colleagues and I at Reason, are actively involved in supporting through op-eds and blogs, and sometimes giving expert testimony, like the $8 billion project in Maryland that the governor is pushing to add express toll lanes to the Maryland side of the beltway around DC. Badly needed, horrendous parking lot during rush hours, and but it's getting attacked by people who say, oh no, the only rich people will use them, they're Lexus lanes, blah blah blah, and the private sector shouldn't be involved in doing this. So those arguments always come up. We know good arguments to counter them, but you have to sign up and show the flag and be in the debate on these things. And we are. Our transportation team tries to monitor these situations in every state where these issues are being discussed, and be a resource for them.
Yeah, well, that's important. And like you said, you have to slay those same dragons over and over again every time you tackle new ground. So
absolutely. We also work cooperatively with state free market think tanks, like the Georgia Public Policy Foundation in Georgia, the Badger Institute in Wisconsin, and others, the Pelican Institute in Louisiana. They can be great partners. They know the local territory better than we do as a national organization. Obviously the internet helps us monitor everything that's going on in transportation, but having the state think tanks there as partners is a great benefit.
I would think. Plus, it just adds more people to your team, as it were, too. So like, that's got to be excellent as well. So
very true. We have great working relationships with a number of them.
Yeah, it just was going to take a lot of continual pressure as you whittle everything down. It's just a slow process, as we've all discovered, having been involved in these things through the years. What, just for everybody else's benefit, what is a little bit of else of what Reason is working on? You're not everybody's familiar.
Yes, yeah. Well, sure. One of our biggest projects and most successful is public sector pension reform. Believe it or not, we have a very competent staff of people now that are recognized as knowing a lot more about public pension accounting and fiscal problems than most state legislators do. So we have actually helped reformers in half a dozen states, including Arizona and Kentucky, to get some significant reforms of public pension systems to make them more financially sound and not something that's going to be a drain on taxpayers ever larger as the years go by. And this is partly replacing defined benefit plans, for at least for new employees, with defined contribution plans like most of us have in the private sector, removing some double dipping opportunities that are widely abused by various state employees and so forth. It's way too complicated to get into all the details. But that's one of our biggest projects. We also continue to work hard on charter schools and school vouchers and the overall area of school choice. And we work with coalitions. We are always part of National School Choice Week every year and help organize events and provide speakers and things like that. And we have a big project that's relatively new on marijuana policy reform, trying to help policymakers in states that have legalized, particularly recreational marijuana. What kind? They always, everybody says, well, we're going to treat it like alcohol, but what does that actually mean? What sort of things do you do? How do you figure out when somebody's an impaired driver on marijuana? Some of the stuff that there aren't answers are not known. But in other cases, we have some good research that is showing people who they legislated, now they don't know what to do with what they've got. And they also tend to put taxes on it so high that it doesn't defeat the purpose of countering the black market. So there's a real need, a real niche there that we are trying to fill with that new marijuana project.
One other little aspect too, become a bit of a media outlet too with this Reason TV. What's kind of up with that, and how successful has that been?
Reason TV has been a huge success. We've won a lot of media awards for it. We produce over 300 videos a year. So that's practically a new one every weekday. And they range from in-depth interviews, like there was just last week, a long, like 45-minute interview with George Will on his new book that quotes Hayek extensively, and short little humorous, satirical things that poke fun at the latest stupid government policy. We have that humorist musician, Remy, who does these wonderful parody pieces. And of course, we have Stossel doing 5-minute op-eds, basically, and sometimes interviewing people. So that has been a terrific success and a huge expansion of Reason's profile.
Fantastic to see what's been done over the years. I've been a follower of the organization for a long, long time, and it's been from like a minuscule little thing that few knew about to a powerhouse. So it's really a testament to you for one, but really more to what the ideas are that it's such a success. So that's really fabulous.
I tell you, to me, it's very gratifying. I can't take credit for most of the successes of the last 15 years, which have been done under my successor, David Knott. He has been a fantastic CEO and has greatly expanded Reason Foundation's reach and influence.
Well, that's great. Well, we're sadly running out of time here today, so let's kind of thank Bob for being here today. And again, we'll want to follow up and see how more of this stuff develops over time. And as you saw, we had all those things exposed, and you'll see in the follow-up release about this, how to follow up and follow him and get linked into some of this stuff. You'll see the video link there, and it ultimately will be posted on our channel. So you'll be able to see that here too. So you'll be able to pass this link around and come back here and see that as well as others. And definitely want to investigate the Reason Foundation itself. Last, we wanted to thank the Freedom Hub for being one of our sponsors for sure, and we're definitely getting more as time goes by. It's been nice to see the market try to merge in a variety of areas, and we're trying to showcase all of it too. And just as a reminder, coming up for the next couple of weeks, next week, which is going to be a really interesting one for anybody that doesn't know about Adam Kokesh, but he was a fantastic he was in Iraq, and he came back and it kind of changed his mind a little bit, and he became a very big advocate against the idea of war in general, and especially that one. And now he's running for president, and it's a very interesting platform he's got. And then we've got John Barillow. He's going to be talking about financial deregulation, just like we're talking about transportation deregulation. And then we're going to talk about with Professor Art Carden on the Society Without Any Government Limits. So we're going to test the hypotheses of where that could take us. And then Ivan Evelyn, which is on overseas intervention and the loss of our liberties by what we